Okay, this is the lecture for Unit 1, Lecture 1. It's called New Worlds. It's about the First Nations of North America. It's about kind of the differences between Europeans and Native Americans when they first came into contact. Both sides thought that the other group was kind of weird. So we'll start talking about that. I like to start it kind of further back in past than a lot of high school history classes start. It seems like way too often we start the history of the Americas at 1492, or we start the history of the United States at 1607, which is when the English founded their first permanent colony in the New World. And sometimes we take a couple of steps back and we talk about the native peoples who were here when Europeans first arrived. We talk about how they interacted for a couple of minutes, and then we kind of forget about them until it's time for a war. And honestly, if we're going to cover North American history from the first human arrival to 1865, we're talking about doing 30,000 years of history in a 15, 16-week class. And that's probably not going to happen. But the problem, well, one of the problems with skimming the early Americas is that, frankly, that's taking the Americans out of American history. Because the first European settlers didn't think of themselves as Americans. Well, neither did the indigenous people, because America wasn't a word when they were first here. But Europeans didn't think of themselves as New Worlders either. They didn't have any real connection to the land for a long time when they arrived here. Many of them didn't intend to settle here. Many of them just came looking for wealth. They had to go back home once they found it. So they stayed English. They stayed Spanish or French or Dutch or even Russian. And it took about 115 years after first contact for the English to start a permanent settlement, and even then they were still English. These colonists didn't start thinking of themselves as Americans, didn't start calling themselves Americans until very, very shortly before the Revolution started. The people who were living here, who were raising families, who were shaping the land, who were Americans, were the Native Americans. And that's the other problem with skipping over them, is that you get the mistaken impression that nothing much happened here until 1492 or 1607 or whatever arbitrary date you want to slap on there. And that makes it easy to forget that quite a lot of white American survival and history is owed to the natives. The Mayflower Company, you've all heard of them, they survived their first winter here, barely, by stealing corn from the local Wampanoags. And then, of course, in the spring, they were given seed corn by the natives. They were taught how to grow their own, mostly so they would stop stealing. The reason that the Plymouth Company survived was that initial cooperation, that dependence on the native peoples. England had tried other northern colonies before, but none of them had survived. And of course, several of the founders of the United States, as a distinct political nation, were influenced by the different ways that Indian nations governed. Like John Adams, for one. He was influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy, by the separation of powers in the governance of the Iroquois Confederacy. Thomas Jefferson, his father, when he was a young boy, took him to meet with the Cherokee leaders. And he continued to do that throughout his life, and he encouraged James Madison, James Monroe, and other young followers of his to do the same thing. So we got to spend a little bit of time talking about the First Nations of North America. We're going to start out in the beginning talking about North America before European arrival, which means talking about the people who were here before European people got here. We're going to start talking about our best guess for how and when these people arrived. And unfortunately, this class is only one semester long. We've got 20 to 30,000 years of history to cover. And that means that this beginning time, these First Nations are getting the short end of the stick. We're not able to go in depth into each nation. We're not really able to go in depth into each region. We're really only going to cover two major regions. And it's a shame, because these were, and continue to be in many cases, fascinating, thriving civilizations that you want to go in and look at, learn about, especially for these students who are members of these nations, which a significant percentage of NEO's campus is. But the standards for this class are, I've got to get you to 1865. Now, I shouldn't have to say this in a class based out of Miami, Oklahoma, Ottawa County, Oklahoma, but it's worth saying, so I will. The nations that we're looking at, for the most part, these are not things of the past. They still exist. The Native American population was, of course, absolutely devastated by the end of the 1800s. But in the last 50 years or so, these nations have started to grow again. We've regained the right to speak our languages, to learn them, to teach them to our children. So these cultures, when we talk about them, don't think of them as being dead cultures. Don't think of them as being only in the past, because they're not. Now, we are going to have to do some generalizations because of the time frame that we've got to work with. But there was so much diversity in North America before European contact. There were actually more nations, more distinct languages, ethnic groups, civilizations in North America than there were in Europe at the time of first contact. So it can be very problematic to generalize. Now, when we come across some interesting deviations from the generalizations that I'm going to make, I will try and stop and talk a little bit about them because those cases can be very fascinating. But there were some philosophies and beliefs that were similar between many of the cultures, especially those that lived in about the same region. There were some aspects of life that tended to hold true. So we're going to talk about what we know and what we think we know, and what we know and what we think we know have changed a lot over time, particularly about early North America. Now, when I was still in high school, they were teaching us that North America had only been inhabited for about 12-ish thousand years ago. And then they started finding more information. They started finding tools, wooden tools that had, what's the word I'm looking for here? Fossilized. Wooden tools that were older than that. They started finding coprolites, which I don't know if you know what that's are. It's basically fossilized species that was even older. And it kept pushing settlement back and pushing settlement back until finally it hit about 30,000 years ago. And now, just this last year, we're starting to get more information suggesting that maybe people were here before that. So what we know and what we think we know changes. For one thing, one of the reasons why what we know about early North America changes is that many of those nations didn't have writing systems. Central American nations did, like the Aztecs, the Mexicans. South American nations did, like the Inca. But up here in what is now the United States, no written records. And even when you are studying a literate society, one that does have written records, you can learn new things. You can have new discoveries, or you can even find out that what was written before was just a flat-out lie. And one of my favorite examples of this is from Middle Eastern history, from Egyptian history. There was a war between Egypt and the Hittites. And what we knew about this war came from the Egyptian histories of it. And the Egyptian histories of it said something to the effect of, we defeated them mightily by the hands of the gods, and then we gave them all of this land, I guess because we're just such nice guys, which is a little suspicious, just thinking about it. We didn't have any information to contradict that until really recently, only about a decade ago. Some archaeologists stumbled upon a Hittite archive, found their history of it, which rang a little more realistic. It looked like Egypt was on the verge of losing its butt until they agreed to give some of this land to the Hittites. I think the pharaoh in charge of that was Ramses II, who is kind of known for exaggerating his military prowess. So what do we do when we don't have any written records? Well, the first thing is you got to listen to people. Pre-literate societies depended on their oral traditions to pass down their history. so their stories could survive. And then once they had a writing system, were written down. And the Indian nations of today are a great example. The Inyo campus is situated between 9 nations, all of them with a strong sense of their own history. Unfortunately, some native groups were destroyed by European explorers and conquerors before anybody got to write down what they had to say. And of course, many Europeans weren't that interested in writing down the histories of the people that they were enslaving or shipping back to Europe or what have you. But some were. Spanish priests in particular often reported the histories of the people they met. They didn't really take it seriously, they didn't believe the stories, but they'd write it down anyway. Some nations further south did have written records, but the conquistadors tried to destroy them. And then, of course, there were civilizations that rose and fell before first contact and left behind only physical remains. Some of those are huge monuments, like the city of Cahokia, east of St. Louis. Sometimes they just left a village site, sometimes just their bones. Now that's archaeology, the study of physical objects, tools, clothes, human remains. That's how people speak to us from thousands of years ago. Tell us a little bit about how they lived, a little bit about how they died, and if we're very lucky, we can learn a little of what was important to them. And when we do that, we usually find out that people are not that different, even thousands of years apart, whether they hunt with a spear or with a shopping cart and a credit card. So let's start with what we have proof of. Tens of thousands of years ago, the earth was a lot colder. The northern seas froze over. One of the places that this happened was a narrow strip of ocean between what is now Russia and Alaska, in the blue up here. Today it's the Bering Strait. There's this little narrow strip that you can sail boats through, but when the glaciers were covering everything, when the ice age was going on, this was all frozen. And it became instead the Bering Land Bridge, and people could walk across it. We know that it froze and melted at various times until it finally kind of permanently warmed up about 12,000 years ago. We know that game animals, like mammoths, wandered from northern Asia across the land bridge down into what is now Canada, and then pushing further and further south. And we know that wave after wave of hunters followed those game animals. Now, it wasn't just one family or just one village that ended up populating all of North and South America. Lots of different groups of people in several ways over several thousand years. We suspect that different ethnic groups made the journey largely because of linguistic evidence, because of the languages that people speak. Some of the Nadim family of languages that's spoken in Western Canada and up in Alaska. That shows a lot of similarities with the Unithian language family that's today spoken in central Siberia. But when the Ice Age ended, when the technical term late glacial maximum ended, about 12,000 years ago, the seas rose permanently. The Bering Land Bridge became once again the Bering Strait that we know today, and the Americas were permanently separated from the rest of the world. And for the most part, both sides forgot about each other. Not entirely, though. There was still some movement. There was still some exploration. New Worlders kind of heading back to the Old World, especially New Worlders who were living in the Pacific, kind of heading back further west again, to where their peoples had come from. But for the most part, both sides kind of forgot about each other. The early hunters and their descendants spread across North and South America. Reached the tip of South America, our latest information says about 11,000 years ago. As the climate warmed up, they faced a food crisis. Just like the people in Asia and Europe and Africa were facing food crises. The giant animals that all of these people had been hunting were becoming extinct because their source of food was going away because of the climate change. About 9,000 years ago, several societies kind of independently developed the idea of agriculture. In the ancient Near East, in what is now Iraq, they developed agriculture. In what is now China, and in what is now Mexico, independently of each other, they all kind of figured this out. As that new technology spread, it allowed people to develop settled civilizations. Now, some nations were able to build permanent settlements, quite large settlements, quite large cities. Others were able to become semi-settled, semi-nomadic. And you might wonder why North America, why what is now the United States, really didn't develop much of an urban civilization. There were some cities. Like Cahokia was a big one, was one of the largest cities in the world at its height. Tenochtitlan, who is now Mexico City, that was obviously massive. There were quite a few reasonably sized cities in the 3,000 to 4,000 range out in the southwest, but for the most part, North Americans were not an urban civilization. North Americans usually did not develop a fully agricultural economy. So why the heck is that? A lot of it is just due to geography, just to bare luck. To have a fully agricultural economy, it helps to have domesticated animals. And North America doesn't have any except dogs. Not even big dogs. Not mastiffs, not Great Danes, little medium-sized dogs, collie-sized dogs. Try strapping a plow to one of them and saying mush. They don't really take it that well. South America did have the llama, which helped them develop a little more agriculture, but up here we just didn't have any. No oxes, no cattle, no horse, until the Europeans arrived. And so that limited how much farming could be done. Certainly limited how much of a surplus it could build up. And without a surplus, you don't get cities. While there were some cities, they mostly depended on their neighbors to feed them. There wasn't enough agriculture to support a widespread urban economy like you got in Africa or Asia or Europe. Ancient cities in North America typically depended on trade or on conquest to get food. That was certainly what the Aztecs did. They went out and conquered their neighbors and then demanded tribute of food and gold and also food sacrifice. Some of those cities were freed up because somebody else was feeding them. Were freed up to develop things like mining and metalworking and monument building. You can certainly see that in Tenochtitlan in Mexico. Had amazing, huge buildings, very intricate gold work, metalworking. The ruins of Cahokia, we have found some really beautifully worked copper artifacts. And in Asia and Europe and Africa, they were able to learn how to make metal alloys, which make better weapons and better tools. But they were able to do that because they had a very large urban economy that we just didn't have. Basically, for lack of a native cow, North America remained largely rural. But in the beginning, the development between the old world and the new world kind of kept pace with each other. They developed agriculture at about the same time. They started building monuments roughly the same time. Actually, the new world was a bit ahead of the old world in that the mounds, the monumental mounds at Watson Brake, Louisiana, are older than the first Egyptian pyramids. They're about 5,400 years old. The civilizations rose and fell because of war or climate change. In the Southwest, the ancestors of today's Hopi and Zuni peoples began to settle into villages about 3,000 years ago, at about the same time that settlement was really starting. The great kingdoms were starting to be built in the Near East. The Southwestern peoples eventually were able to build reasonably large, 3,000 to 4,000 again people, towns, carefully planned towns with multifamily housing, like apartment buildings, like in this picture. This is the picture of Chaco Canyon, which you can still visit today. And what kind of look on this picture like anthills are actually 2- and 3-story homes. And you would enter them by ladders up to the roof, and then you climb ladders down to the inside, which made it actually very defensible in case of attack. Somebody would attack you, you pull up the ladders. They can't get in. Chaco Canyon, Acoma Pueblo looks very similar to this. You can visit that as well. Acoma Pueblo was the oldest continually occupied city in the continental United States. These people who lived in the Southwest, they conducted trade. These peoples as far away as central Mexico, the Mississippi River Valley. The people who lived along the Rio Grande, which is now our border with Mexico, they perfected the techniques of desert farming. They had irrigation systems to water their corn and their beans and their cotton. They also bred corn specifically to be drought resistant. Further west, they practiced dry farming, which is becoming quite an in thing today in agriculture. If you're an ag student, you've heard of dry farming. That means that you plant in dry land, but you plant in the dry riverbeds. You plant in the washes and the arroyos. And when the rainy season comes, when the snow on the mountain melts, it will flood where you planted. And that way you don't have to bring in water. You don't have to bring in irrigation. Nature does it for you. Typically in the Southwest, the men were farmers, and the women would gather wild fruit. The government of the people of the Southwest varied widely. It tended to depend on how big your town was. Bigger town, more organized government. In the big pueblos, in the big settlements, they often had a town council. There would be one person directing the council, and there would be people in charge of different necessary aspects, like a commissioner of water management, who would make sure that every family had drinking water, who would make sure that the irrigation was in good repair. Further west, especially as you start getting up into the mountains, settlements tended to be smaller, and so the government was much more loosely organized. Each village kind of governed itself, usually by consent of all adult men of the village. In the western mountains, though, among the Apache, it was a little bit different. There was no central government for them. The decisions were made by consent of all adults, not just adult men, but adult women as well. The Apache were different from many of their neighbors. They were matrilineal, which means that they traced their bloodlines through their mothers and not their fathers. And they were matrilocal, which meant that when a young woman married, she stayed in her family and her husband came to live with her instead of going to live with her husband's family, which is what most of their neighbors did. The Indians of the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys, over 1,000 years before Columbus ever set sail, were called mound builders because they built massive burial mounds. They were trading halfway across the continent. You go to places like Chillicothe, Ohio today, and the extent of their trade networks is just mind-boggling. But these were people who were traveling on foot. They didn't have horses to ride. If they wanted to trade or they wanted goods from far away, they had to walk it. And there were goods in the mounds there at Chillicothe that came from as far away as what is now Yellowstone, which is a heck of a long way to walk just to get obsidian blades. But they did it. By the year 1000, the city of Cahokia, which is east of St. Louis, had a population of more than 10,000 people. It was a massive city. It had more people than the city of London, England had at the same time. This is an artist's rendition of what Cahokia might have looked like when people lived there. We still have the ruins of the monuments, but obviously things like the thatch roofs didn't survive. In Cahokia, they mined salt, and they traded for some other mined goods like chert and copper. They actually had a small industry there in Cahokia that manufactured stone farming tools. Other groups that were kind of connected to Cahokia included Natchez. And the Natchez were very unlike their neighbors. They had one of the most developed religious hierarchies of the pre-Columbian era. They had what we call a theocracy, which means that the religious establishment ran the government. The priests ran the government. The high priest of the Natchez was the head of state. They had a highly stratified society, complete with a noble class, mostly made up of warriors, and then essentially kind of a peasant class underneath them. And that was very unusual in pre-Columbian North America. You hardly ever saw something like that. In fact, the nearest place to the Natchez that had something similar were the Aztecs down in central Mexico. The Natchez were very closely linked to the Aztecs through trade, which is how we suspect that sort of religious hierarchy and that stratified society built up, because all of their neighbors were kind of governed by consent people. They were not a hierarchy-based people. Further east, closer to the coast, hundreds of tribes lived in towns, lived in villages. They were basically farming communities, semi-settled. They would move every few years when the land would start to get worn out. They'd find a new place, but then they would eventually cycle back to their original spot. They grew corn and squash and beans, and they hunted the deer and the turkey. Their trade routes crisscrossed the eastern part of the continent. Their groups fought over who had the right to trade here, who had the right to hunt here. In the 1400s, the very early 1400s, various leagues, various confederations, alliances of people started to form, creating kind of a centralized form of government for many of these tribes. In the southeast, the Choctaw and the Cherokee and the Chickasaw and the Creek each united dozens of towns into loose alliances. And each of those nations brought something distinct to the table that the people they were allied with could benefit from. Like the Creeks, they had a lot of diplomats, they had a lot of ambassadors living with other nations. And so the people who were allied with them, with the Creeks or the Cherokee or the Chickasaw, they got to benefit from that diplomatic network. The Choctaws had a very, very strong trade system. Up in the northeast, in what is now about New York, 5 Iroquoian peoples, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Onondaga, formed what they called the Great League of Peace, which today we usually call the Iroquois Confederacy. Basically, it was meant to stabilize what was a really chaotic military political situation. These nations, these 5 nations, were all quite large. They were all very powerful. Any one of them could sort of subjugate their neighbors pretty easily, but they were fighting against each other, the other big kids on the block. Once they agreed to form this confederacy, once they agreed to form this alliance, it stabilized that situation. Their neighbors knew, the smaller neighbors knew, that they were probably going to get stomped on, but at least it was only going to be done once by the Confederacy instead of 5 times one after another. Every year, a great council of the Confederacy would meet. Representatives from the 5 nations were sent to discuss issues, to coordinate their policies toward their neighbors. One interesting thing about the Great Council is that all of the representatives were men. But in some of the nations, they were chosen by the women. The women said which men got to go to these councils. Women also had the power to review the laws that their individual tribes made, and they had the power to veto those laws if they felt that they were not beneficial for the tribe. Really the most striking feature of Native American society by the time the Europeans arrived was just its sheer diversity. Each group had its own political system, its own religious beliefs. North America was home to literally hundreds of languages. The natives didn't think of themselves as a single people. That was an idea invented by Europeans who didn't notice or didn't care about the differences between groups. Most native identities centered on their immediate social group, their tribe, their village, their confederacy. So when Europeans did arrive, many native groups jockeyed for position. They tried to use the newcomers to strengthen themselves, to strengthen their own nation, to give their nation more power. But they did not unite against the Europeans until they realized that it was actually more of a threat than a benefit from them. And in some cases, that took quite a while. Nonetheless, the diverse societies of North America did share some common characteristics. And these characteristics that they tended to share were part of the reason why Europeans felt so justified in taking over and judging the natives as inferior or as heathen. For one thing, Native American spiritual life tended to kind of permeate everything. There was not a lot of separation between religious life and private life. There was really no concept of secular. Religious ceremonies aimed to harness the aid of the supernatural forces to serve the interests of the people. Europeans did exactly the same thing. Europeans held religious ceremonies to harness more powerful forces to help them. It's called Mass. It's called prayer. Native Americans didn't confine themselves, usually, to one particular god. In some groups, hunters would perform rituals before going out to hunt. They would try to placate the spirits of the animals that they had killed afterwards. Villages would have elaborate ceremonies, elaborate religious rites to kind of like define your role in the community, like coming of age ceremonies. In all of the societies, those who seem to have particular abilities, like special wisdom or healing abilities, they all held positions of respect and authority. Now, in the Christian world, there was a much more sharp distinction between religious and secular, between natural and supernatural. But in some respects, the beliefs of Europeans were not that different than the beliefs of natives. Many native groups believed that while there was a spirit in every living thing, that there was one single creator, which is something that Catholics believe, which is what all of Europe was at this time. Europe also had a lot of people still practicing folk magic, folk religion, superstitious beliefs, things like carving up jack-o'-lanterns to scare away evil spirits at a certain time of the year when the fall was starting to end. That's something that the Catholic Church frowned on, but the regular people would do it anyway. Nonetheless, nearly all Europeans decided that Indians desperately needed to change their religious life. In some cases, that was out of a genuine desire to spread salvation as they understood it. But in some other cases, it was more of an excuse to exploit the natives and their land. And the native attitude toward that land was another thing that Europeans really didn't understand. In most native communities in what's now the U.S., the idea of private property was not at all like the European idea. In fact, in many cases, the idea of private property simply didn't exist. The more nomadic a tribe was, the less their ideas of land ownership and land management was like the European idea. So you would have a nomadic or a semi-nomadic group out in the Ohio Territory. They would have a large area where they hunted, and then they would have a kind of a more compact area where they would winter, where they would maybe plant a little bit. And that was land that could only be hunted and only be planted by members of that nation. But the whole nation held it together. Then you had some slightly more settled people. They would have towns and villages and farm plots that could only be used by people of that nation or of that particular village. But the village would use it in common. And then, of course, there were actually a couple of tribes where each family would have their own plot. Now, that sort of land ownership was much more familiar to the Europeans, but still, nobody had a deed to that land. Nobody had the paperwork. Nobody had proof as Europeans understood it. What they had was, this is where we farm because it's where we farm, where we've been farming for hundreds of years. So when Europeans came over and they bought land, thought they were buying land or thought they were trading for land, there was a real disconnect between what Europeans thought that meant and what natives thought that meant. Chief Sitting Bull, way after this colonial period in the late 1800s, said that it was ridiculous to think that anyone could buy the land and own the land because humans didn't create the land. You can't own the air, you can't own the seas, you can't own the land. You can only own what you yourself create. So when Europeans would hand over, a crate of rifles or something, or some pots and pans and think, now we own this, Native Americans simply did not understand what the heck they were talking about. They often thought that they were giving Europeans the right to share this land. Yeah, you can come and hunt where we hunt. You can come and plant a little bit where we plant. But they never seemed to understand that Europeans expected them to pack up and leave, and that they would never be able to come back to this land again. Sometimes these situations became really tragic, like extra tragic. You may have heard about the Manhattan Island incident when Dutch settlers first arrived. Now, when I was in school, what they told us was that the Dutch paid for the entirety of Manhattan Island with $23 worth of beads. Ha ha, silly Native Americans, they didn't know that that was a bad deal. That's not actually what happened. The people that took the beads were not the people who really used that land. They had been given the right to hunt on that land by the people who were native to Manhattan Island. So when they took those beads from the Dutch, they believed that they were sharing their right to hunt there. They did not mean for themselves to no longer be allowed to hunt there. It certainly didn't mean that the people who had shared this right with them would be forced to pack up and leave. They never intended that. So that land deal was especially sad. And with a few exceptions, like the Natchez, like we talked about, Native American societies tended to not be very stratified. There wasn't a whole lot of emphasis on building up wealth, building up possessions. For one thing, if you're a semi-nomadic people, if you're in a farming community that has to move to new cropland every few years to let the old soil rest, it doesn't make sense to cart around a bunch of stuff. You don't want to build up a lot of possessions because you just got to move it all. And since the majority of nations saw their leaders be elected or be chosen in some form, they really didn't have any concept of inherited power. There wasn't a very strict hierarchy. In many nations, especially small ones, there was no real hierarchy at all. In general, wealth and inherited status meant much less to Native Americans than it did to Europeans. There wasn't usually extreme inequality within a particular nation. If anybody in a village starved, it was because the crops had failed and everybody was starving, not because this person was at the very lowest rungs of society. And speaking of the lowest rungs of society, the status of Native women freaked a lot of Europeans out too. The first women that Europeans met were the ones who lived in the South, down in the Caribbean, in Mexico, where it's warm, where they didn't wear as many layers of clothing as European women did, especially because Europe was beginning to feel the effects of the Little Ice Age. From about 1300 to 1850, glaciers actually started to expand in northern Europe. The winters were brutal. Sometimes there were no real summers at all. And of course it was much colder in general. up in Europe than it was in Barbados or Jamaica. So these new women that the European men were meeting tended to be, by their standards, scantily clad. Many of them had no objection to premarital sex. They were allowed to divorce their husbands. They had rights. It was like anarchy in the European view to allow women to have these rights. Many of the tribes down south were matrilineal, which gave precedence to mothers. Europeans didn't understand that. Council members tended to be men, but just like with the Iroquois, they were often chosen or approved by the women. Women were allowed to take part in village meetings. Well, under European law, that didn't happen, particularly in English law. A married man controlled his family's property entirely. His wife had no independent legal identity. She simply didn't exist in any legal way, so she certainly had no rights. Indian women, by contrast, owned their homes, owned their tools, owned the profits of what they made, what they sold. In nations that did a lot of hunting, when the men were gone for a long time, the women would run the village economy. They would run the village government. And Europeans just flipped their lids over this. So that's a little bit about what Europeans thought of Native Americans when they first met. But how did that meeting happen? We all know Columbus in 1492 in Ocean Blue. Some of you may be familiar with the Viking explorations up in Canada in the 900s. But they didn't stay very long, and they apparently had no real impact. What really started this interest in exploration was the European desire for Asian and African trade goods and gold. Western Europe had been trading with Asia along what was called the Silk Road for hundreds of years. The Silk Road stretched from Italy, from the states of Italy across the Middle East, across the land of Central Asia into China. There was a branch that went down into India. The Silk Road was a long, difficult journey, but it would get you there, and it would get you back. For many years, the Silk Road was controlled by the Mongols, was protected by the Mongols. Now, we don't think of the Mongols as being great traders, right? We think of them as the Mongol hordes that invaded Europe and burned towns and took over all of these places. But they were actually very good at making money. And taxing the Silk Road, protecting and taxing the Silk Road was a great moneymaker for them. But when Mongol rule in Central Asia collapsed during about the mid-1300s, the petty warlords in the area, the bandits, took control of the trade routes. And that was bad for business. European traders couldn't cross by land anymore, so they tried going through the Mediterranean down through here, but then they would have to deal with the Turks, who were Muslim, and who had also been fighting lots of wars with the Europeans. This is the era of the Crusades, right? From time to time, Europe and the Ottoman Empire didn't like each other very much. So you couldn't always get through there. While Europe was trying to figure out how to get to Asia, to get the spices and get the silks and get all the stuff that they wanted, suddenly they started to notice sub-Saharan Africa as well. Sub-Saharan Africa is, as you probably guessed, everything south of the Sahara. Europeans have been trading with North Africa for a while, whenever we weren't fighting with the Ottoman Empire. But the rest of Africa was kind of unknown to Europe, and it was almost impossible to get to. You pretty much had to go across the desert. You couldn't go by sea very effectively, because the west coast of Africa has this really weird wind situation. See this little kind of prominent area here? You're sailing south down the coast, down, down, down. You get to about this spot, and the winds start to only blow south. which is fine as long as you want to travel south. But what happens when you get down here, you get your trade goods and you want to go home? You can't sail north. Not with the technology that Europeans had at the time. They had no way to tack against the wind, is what they call it. They couldn't do it. For the most part, Europeans didn't care. So they didn't really know what was in sub-Saharan Africa. They didn't know that there might be something there that they wanted. But in 1324, suddenly everybody started talking about Mali, the Empire of Mali. Today, Mali is a nation situated about there in West Africa. The Empire of Mali in 1324 was about that. It was huge, and it was wealthy. The Emperor of Mali was a man named Mansa Musa, and he put his realm on the European map by making his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca. Mali was and is still today majority Muslim. So Mansa Musa went to Mecca, as good Muslims do, and he gave away so much gold on this trip. He gave away gold to mosques, to schools, to beggars, to dancing girls, that the value of gold in Europe dropped for more than a decade. There was just so much gold everywhere. And of course, the rest of the world is going, where the heck did he get all of that gold? And for him, it wasn't even a thing. It was a drop in the bucket. He had so much gold left that he could depreciate the value of gold in Europe and not even notice it for himself. So where did he get all of that gold? And most importantly, where can Europe's kings get it? How can they get their hands? It took more than a century for a European nation to figure out how to make that sea voyage to Mali and get back home. That European power was Portugal. We don't think about a whole lot today. You may not know offhand where to look on a map to find Portugal. But back then, Portugal was becoming very important. Portugal had a young prince that was very interested in sea travel, in trade, and he was very focused on making Portugal a great nation, a powerful nation. So Prince Henry, they called him Henry the Navigator. He invited the best and the brightest minds in naval technology to come to Portugal and to create a new kind of navy. He brought people from 1,000 miles away from the Netherlands, people who could build sturdy boats that could sail through the icy North Seas. He brought in Turkish navigators. They developed new methods of map making. They learned how to use old, ancient Arab navigational tools like the astrolabe. They built new tools. Most importantly, they built a new kind of ship, the caravel, one of the most important inventions in human history. Now, the caravel was much sturdier than other ships of the time. It could stand up to very strong winds. It was also very quick. It was very agile. And most importantly, it could move the sails, which meant it could tack against the wind. And that is something that no other European ship at this time could do. Not only could they sail along the African coast to Mali, they could sail back home. In 1434, 110 years after they started trying, the Portuguese ship brought a sprig of rosemary from West Africa back home as proof that they were able to sail past the desert and return. Little by little, Portuguese ships started moving further and further down the coast. In 1485, they reached the nation of Benin, which was a fairly imposing city, lots of craftsmen. They produced some really remarkable bronze sculptures. The Portuguese began to establish trading posts along the coast, and they inspired other European nations to follow them. Portugal also started to colonize the islands off the coast of Africa. They built sugar plantations. The labor was supplied by thousands of African slaves. And when the New World opened up, they moved the sugar plantations and the slaves to the Americas. Slavery in Africa predated the Europeans. There were slaves there long before. There were slaves all over the world long before this. But traditionally, African slaves were not lifelong. They were criminals who had to serve out a certain time. They were debtors who had to pay off their debt. They were prisoners of war who would be kept as slaves as long as the war lasted. But when the war was over, when the debt was paid, when the crime was atoned for, they would be free. They had rights, well-defined legal rights. They were able to possess property. They were able to marry free people. Their children were not automatically slaves. Most African slaves were able to purchase the freedom or marry out of slavery or just be set free. Slavery was one of several forms of labor. It was not the basis of the entire economy the way it became in the New World. And when the Portuguese and later other Europeans arrived, it really sped up the slave trade within Africa. At least 100,000 African slaves were transported to Spain and Portugal, not to colonies, but to those nations themselves between 1450 and 1500. In 1502, the first African slaves were transported to the Caribbean. Now, a few African nations, like Benin at first, tried to opt out of the slave trade because it was so far beyond what they thought of as the natural order of things. It was too much. It was too big. But many did participate, and it became a big moneymaker for the strongest of the African empires. It was a travesty for anybody else in Africa. Sometimes in the 21st century, students look back at this and say, how could Africans enslave their own people? How could they allow their own people to be taken away as slaves? And that is not what happened. You got to understand this. Africans are not one people, just like Native Americans are not one people, just like Europeans are not one people. There are Ashanti, there are Igbo, there are all sorts of different people. They weren't enslaving their own people. You've got places like Mali, with the empire of Mali that was so strong and so powerful, and such a huge military. They could invade their neighbors, take prisoners of war, and sell them. They weren't selling their own people. They were selling their traditional enemies. It was a good deal for them, actually. Usually you take a prisoner of war, you got to house him, you got to feed him, then eventually you got to turn him loose. And the next time there's a war, hell, he could fight against you again. But you sell him off to the Portuguese, who take them God only knows where across the ocean. You don't have to pay for the food. You don't have to pay for the housing, and he is never going to come back and fight against you. That was their logic there. The Atlantic slave trade was a profit-making endeavor for everybody who was involved. At both ends, the trade benefited from state support. African rulers allowed kidnappers free rein, and they collected taxes on the captives passing through their territory. European kings chartered and taxed the slave companies. The new U.S. Congress, when it was formed, was forbidden to outlaw the slave trade until 1808. Now, slavery had existed all over the world for as long as we have written history. It certainly existed in Africa. But it was just different. Between the start of the European encroachment on the Americas in 1492 and the end of the Atlantic slave trade in 1867, Europeans transported a minimum of 10 million Africans to the Americas, averaged about 170 slave ships every year. At its height, 80,000 people a year were kidnapped. That is an unbelievably huge number. Africa never saw slave numbers that big before the transatlantic trade started. About 95% of those people were sent to Brazil and the Caribbean, brutal labor in the sugar-growing parts of South America. They were usually worked to an early death. On average, they didn't live 4 years. They didn't have enough children to reproduce themselves because of bad conditions, because of lack of women, because of a truly appalling infant mortality rate. So their numbers had to be constantly replenished by kidnapping new people. So Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus is another one of those characters, another one of those issues where what we know and what we think we know don't always match up. A lot of what we think we know about Columbus was written by Columbus, who of course wanted to make himself look as good as possible, and may not be entirely true. What we do know is that he had been a navigator for many years. We believe that he was from Italy. He said he was from Genoa, Italy. That was probably true. We do know that for years he had sailed around the Mediterranean, around the North Atlantic, studying the currents, studying the wind patterns. I don't know when you were going to school, but when I was going to school, grade school, they were still passing around that old story that Columbus is the only man who knew the earth was round, that nobody believed him. They all thought the earth was flat, and his sailors thought they were just going to sail off the edge of the world and die. That's not true. It's a very entertaining story that Columbus alone knew the truth and everybody around him was stuck in the dark ages. But that's not how it went down. That's not why he had such a hard time getting a financial backup. The reason why Columbus had to spend years searching for somebody to give him money and support his journey is because he had this cockamamie idea that he could get from Europe to China in a month or less. He miscalculated how big the Earth is, the circumference of the Earth. He believed that Asia was much, much closer than it was. Now, nobody in Europe really knew that there were these two giant continents blocking the way, but they knew for sure it would take more than a month to get to China. I suppose if they'd gone and asked the Vikings, they would have found out about at least one of those giant continents, but nobody asked them. Well, Columbus went around Europe, sent his brother around Europe too, trying to find a king or a nobleman or just a wealthy person who could support his journey. His brother actually went to the King of England, Henry VII of England, to ask him to fund Columbus's journey. That is kind of a fun historical rabbit hole to go down. How would U.S. history be different if England had been the country to start colonizing America? But Henry VII was a notorious tightwad, and also he had advisors telling him that Columbus had his map wrong. Most of Columbus's fellow navigators knew that he had drastically underestimated the size of the Earth, and it kind of undermines your argument if you're trying to get money out of a king and there's some guy standing right there saying, man, you are wrong, you are so wrong, you cannot get there in a month. It kind of sucks. Eventually, the King and Queen of Spain agreed to become sponsors. And there was a very specific set of circumstances that led them to make that decision. Ferdinand and Isabella had essentially created the modern nation of Spain. When they married, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had united the Spain that had been going through kind of a civil war. They created a united Spain. And then they joined forces and they drove the Moors out of Spain. The Moors were Muslims from North Africa. For centuries, they had ruled Spain, while the Catholics of Spain, the Christians of Spain, had been trying to get them out. And it wasn't until Ferdinand and Isabella joined their forces together that they were able to complete what they called the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from the Muslims. Now they've done this. They have created this unified nation. They want to build a strong nation. They want to build a powerful nation. They want to have all the trappings of being a powerful couple. They wanted things like the spices and the silks and all of the fancy things, but they didn't want to have to deal with the Turkish traders to get Asian and African trade goods. They wanted the stuff, but they just burned a few too many bridges to get it that way. And then Columbus comes along with his wild idea, and it's a shot in a million, but they gambled on it. Because what else are you going to do? They gave him royal letters of introduction to give to the rulers of whatever Asian nations he might find. They authorized him to negotiate trade agreements on their behalf. They figured he would die out in the middle of the ocean, so they didn't give him a whole lot of money. They gave him enough for only 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. 2 of those ships were caravels. One of them was a more modern version of a caravel. Without the caravel, Columbus's journey would not have happened. He wouldn't have the technology to get to the New World, to even think about making this journey. So they figured if this works, it's probably not going to work, but if it works, we get the stuff that we want. We get all of these riches that we want without having to go through our enemies. I mean, they had completed this conquest, the Reconquista, in 1492, the same year that Columbus came here. And if they can get these trade agreements directly with the Chinese, directly with the Indians, directly with the Burmese or whoever, then they're one up on all of their neighbors. They become a much more powerful nation. So if it works, it won't work. But if it works, they're doing a lot better. They're creating this powerful modern nation. On October 12th, 1492, after only 33 days of sailing, Columbus and his expedition saw land. And hey, Columbus had predicted they would hit Asia in about a month, so score, they did it. We're not entirely sure where he first landed. Most historians believe that the place he called San Salvador was an island that for centuries we called Guatman Island. The residents today call it San Salvador. Columbus was like, hey, I reached India. Wait a second, this place is tiny. Columbus went to his grave believing that he was in Asia, but the islands. He just couldn't find the mainland. All right, San Salvador is an island off the coast of India. All right, I'm going to call this one Barbados. It's an island off the coast of India. He found Cuba, he found Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. When he went back to Spain, Columbus took 10 natives of Hispaniola as proof that he had been to India, and also so they could be converted to Christianity. The following year, 1493, Columbus went back. Ferdinand and Isabella were so happy with him, they gave him 17 ships and more than 1,000 men, and the colonization of the New World began. It took quite a while to really get going, until about 1502 actually, to really get a permanent settlement going. Spain also paid for other men to go exploring. They paid a man named Amerigo Vespucci. He found the coastline of South America. He pretty conclusively proved that this was not India, that it was indeed a new continent. Columbus hated Vespucci because Columbus believed that he had found Asia, and here's this other guy saying, nope, this is something new. The general consensus is that America gets its date from Amerigo Vespucci. But recently, a couple of people have pointed out that the natives of Venezuela call their land Amaraca. So now we're not entirely sure. No one knows how many people lived in North and South America at the time of first contact. Estimates go up to about 75 million. For comparison, the population of Europe at the time was about 70 million. Most of the natives of the New World lived in Central and South America. In what is now the United States, only an estimated 10 million people. But whatever the number was, the Indian population everywhere suffered a catastrophic decline because of contact with Europeans and their wars, enslavement, and especially diseases like influenza and measles and smallpox. You build up immunity and antibodies to these diseases by being exposed to them, especially as children, but they hadn't been exposed. There was no built-up immunity, and the result was devastating. Many nations in the West Indies, the ones that got the first contact right away, they were just wiped out. On Hispaniola, when Columbus first arrived, they had a population of about 300,000 people. In 50 years, they were almost all gone. The population of Mexico fell by 90% in one century, from 20 million down to 2 million. As for the area that is now the United States, the native population continued to fall all throughout the 16th, 17th, and 1800s. From 10 million, it reached a low point in the census of 1900 at 250,000. The speed with which European exploration proceeded is quite remarkable. And a lot of that speed is due to another invention that you might not think about in terms of exploration, and that's the printing press. The printing press was invented in the 1430s. Gutenberg's press with the movable type, 1430s. And that made it possible for people to spread information much more quickly than they had before, at least among people who could read, which was a small percentage. The news of Columbus's journey traveled fast, and it inspired other countries to try the same thing. Henry VII, the guy who had refused to back Columbus, paid for John Cabot, who was also from Italy, to go to north of where Columbus had gone and see what he could find. He found the coast of Newfoundland in 1497, and soon fishermen from England were fishing along the coast of eastern Canada and taking these exotic new fishes back to Europe. The Portuguese claimed Brazil in 1500, but it was really the Spanish who took the lead in exploration and conquest. Mostly they were looking for wealth, looking for spices and gold, but they also took with them missionaries who carried flags with crosses on them, and they demanded that the natives convert or die. The first explorer to encounter one of the major urban civilizations was Hernán Cortés. He was a Spanish conquistador. He arrived at the Aztec capital, the Mexican capital, Tenochtitlan, in 1519. At the time, Tenochtitlan had about 200,000 residents. It's a lot bigger than Miami is even today. It was a massive temple. There was a big royal palace. There was a central marketplace. One of Cortez's men said that it looked like an enchanted vision. It was the center of the Aztec Empire. Of their wealth and their power rested on being able to dominate their neighbors. They demanded tribute of crops, of gold, and certainly of sacrifices. The Spanish already kind of viewed all of the natives as barbarians, and this human sacrifice thing that the Aztecs were doing, that certainly reinforced that view. I think we can all agree that human sacrifice is bad. But we also need to remember that in Spain, at the same time, men and women were being burned alive as religious heretics. Criminals were being executed in really gory public spectacles. So it's not like Spain is much better. It didn't take long for Cortez to conquer the city. Some people like to use that as evidence that the Europeans were obviously superior. And Cortez did have better firepower, but he only had a few hundred men. His firepower was not that good. He won because he had native help. He went to those neighbors. He went to those people that the Aztecs had dominated and subjugated, and he said, they have taken your gold, they've taken your food, they've taken your children. I can help you kill them if you help me. And he was also helped along by a smallpox epidemic that devastated the city and really incapacitated most of the Aztec army. Pretty soon, fleets of ships carried gold and silver from the mines of Mexico back to Spain, made Spain the wealthiest nation in Europe. By the middle of the 1500s, Spain had established an immense empire. Their empire wasn't just in the New World either, but the parts of the New World that they controlled were the parts that had the most people and the richest resources. Their New World empire stretched from the tip of South America, the Andes, up through Mexico, through the Caribbean, eventually into the southwestern United States up through Colorado and California. On paper, it was massive. Its center was Mexico City, the capital of the Spanish New World. It was built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Churches, hospitals, and monasteries. The first university in the Americas was built in Mexico City. Still exists today. Very large university. Has a couple 100,000 students, I believe. When the French and the English, when they started to come over and colonize, they tended to be rural and scattered. But Spain, from the beginning, was an urban civilization. They wanted an empire of towns. For centuries, the Spanish-American cities of Mexico City and Lima, Quito, were far more impressive than many of the cities back in Europe were. Now, the Spanish Empire also had a system of colonial government that was very complex and at first very efficient. After the conquistadors swept through with the raping and the pillaging, the Spanish crown kind of freaked out, and they replaced them with a more stable system of government. They wanted lawyers and bureaucrats, not swords. At first, the government of Spanish America was very similar to the government of Spain itself. Spain had absolute rulers, which in theory means that they have complete control over every aspect of society. Law and authority starts with the king. The king created a Council of the Indies to handle the colonies. The king would have to approve everything, but the council would appoint officials that would be sent over and have absolute authority in the colonies in the name of the king. The church also played a significant role in the colonies in how they were ruled. The Pope had full authority over matters of faith and morals and treatment of the Indians. A Spanish king did not like democracy. They did not want elected assemblies. They didn't want it in Spain. They didn't want it in their New World empire. So colonial officials were appointed, not elected, and they were almost always born in Spain itself, rather than being born in a colony. Even a couple hundred years later, fresh new officials from Spain kept the empire and the king on everybody's mind, and they continually refreshed Spanish custom, Spanish tradition. If you appoint officials from the colonies, if you stop sending people directly from Spain, eventually people will forget about Spain. They forget about the king. He's so far away. But by appointing Spanish-born officials, the king kept his place, not just at the top of the food chain, but as a constant reminder of who people served and what power he had over them. Now, that lasted for about as long as Spain remained a strong, relevant power in Europe, and eventually Spain would fall. By the late 1500s, their great armada and navy that they used to control the oceans had been all but destroyed, and in the early 1600s, their European empire started to crumble. For a couple of hundred years, Spain had controlled European nations like the Netherlands and the German states and parts of Austria and Hungary, and presumably they would have gone on controlling these places without much trouble, except for this one guy. One guy essentially created the fall of Spain. Pesky little priest named Martin Luther. He got the whole continent all stirred up, and he started the Protestant Reformation. Spain was Catholic. The Netherlands, the German states that Spain controlled, they were at the heart of the Reformation. So instead of being able to concentrate on their empire, this massive, profitable American empire, Spain had to pay attention to Europe. They'd pull their soldiers out of the New World and send them marching on Europe. Those religious wars lasted for about 200 years. 200 years of time, money, and attention being taken away from the empire. And that meant that American-born Spaniards were able to take more and more control. Hey, Your Majesty, we know you're busy. So we just went ahead and we wrote up this list of recommendations. We promise they're good. Why don't you just sign it? Eventually, local city councils would be elected. God, an election, if you think that. And they, along with the monasteries and the universities and the craftsmen's guilds, pretty much took control of the American empire away from the people. Now, even though there had been a massive decline in the native population, Spanish America still had enough Indians that, for the most part, they decided there wasn't much need for a large-scale African slave trade. Now, on the islands, they imported a lot of Africans, so much of them mainland. Instead, thousands, tens of thousands of Indians were forced to work in the mines, the gold and silver mines, that created the wealth of the empire. They were forced to work on the big farms, the haciendas, controlled by Spanish landlords. In Spanish America, unlike other New World empires, Indians performed the vast majority of the labor. And although the Spanish introduced new kinds of livestock and wheat and sugar, the main agricultural crops were the same ones that had been grown before colonization, the corn and the beans and squash. Spanish citizens were encouraged to settle in the New World, and many of them went for a chance at land, for a chance at advancement. Remember, in Europe, land was a mark of wealth and nobility, but there wasn't enough land to go around. You come to the New World, you get that land. In the first 300 years, about 750,000 Spaniards went to the Americas. At first, the vast majority were young, single men. Many of them were laborers, craftsmen, soldiers, and they wanted to gain that status that they could never have at home. All of them wanted Indian slaves because building wealth without having to labor for it yourself was again a sign of nobility. The most successful men were able to enjoy luxuries that only back home the very, very upper classes would have, things that they themselves would never have dreamed of if they'd stayed on stage. Many of those very successful men had not been born into the nobility. The New World provided them opportunities to advance, using other people's land and labor, of course. So the people who had actually been born in Spain were at the top of the social pyramid. But as time went on, the criollos, the American-born Spanish citizens, began to take more and more control. An intermixing of people began at first contact. By 1600, people of mixed origin, the mestizos, made up the largest part of the North American urban population. In the century that followed, mestizos repopulated the Valley of Mexico, where the disease had devastated the original inhabitants. Over time, Spanish America evolved into a hybrid culture, part Spanish, part Indian, in some areas, part African, but with a single official religion and language and government. An example of this blending of cultures is the Virgin of Guadalupe, you might have heard of. In 1531, an Indian woman reported seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary as a dark-skinned Indian woman near her village, the village of Guadalupe, Mexico. The Virgin of Guadalupe came to be revered by millions, whether they were Indian or mestizo or Spanish, and she became a symbol of the modern nation of Mexico. A few Spaniards stopped to wonder what exactly gave them the right to claim land that had been lived on and worked by other people. They had immense confidence in the superiority of their culture. They expected the societies that they encountered to abandon their own beliefs, their own traditions, to embrace Spanish culture. And when people didn't want to embrace Spanish culture, it just reinforced their belief that those people are barbaric, they're uncivilized, they're not even capable of being civilized. Europeans brought with them not only a long history of using violence against other nations and sometimes their own people, but also a real missionary zeal to spread the benefits of their own civilization, and Spain was no exception. Spain established their overseas empire in the wake of this great Conquista, with a newly powerful government, unified territory, and the Pope helped them along by officially dividing the Western Hemisphere. In 1493, the Pope drew a line on the map and said, everything east of here is Portugal's, everything west of here is Spain's, which meant Portugal essentially got Brazil, and Spain got to claim the rest of it. The Pope totally ignored the rest of Europe. They didn't get a claim in anything, even though they had started to explore and in some cases even try to settle in some of those areas. That's going to have an effect on Europe during the Protestant Reformation. One of the reasons why Spain and Portugal stayed loyally Catholic is because the Pope generally treated them pretty well. Northern Europe felt kind of screwed in the deal, and so they were more friendly for Protestantism. The Pope justified dividing the New World by requiring Spain and Portugal to spread Catholicism to the natives. Spain and Portugal were already used to forced conversions, what with their wars against the Muslims and the Inquisitions against the Jews and the Muslims. To them, their national glory and their religious mission went hand in hand. Spain insisted that their primary goal in colonization was to save the Indians and also to make them. They said that their goal wasn't to exterminate the Indians, not to push them off their land, but to make them better, transform them into obedient Christian subjects. Many Spanish writers insisted that Indians could eventually be raised up into European civilization, but only if their political structures, their spiritual lives, and their cultures were absolutely destroyed first. To the Spanish colonizers, the large native population were not just souls to be saved, but also a labor force to be organized to get the gold and the silver that Spain wanted. The tension between these two goals, save the souls, make the money, scarred Spanish rule in America for 3 centuries. On the one hand, Spanish rulers claimed that they were trying to bring true freedom to the Indians by converting them. On the other hand, Spanish rule caused a disastrous fall in the Indian population, not just because of epidemics, but also because of the brutal conditions that they were subject to. The conquistadors, the governors, they required people to acknowledge the Catholic Church and to slave in the mines for gold and silver. They saw no conflict, they saw no contradiction between serving God and enriching themselves. But over time, some other people did start to see a conflict. As early as 1537, Pope Paul III outlawed the enslavement of Indians. He declared that Indians were, in his words, truly men who must not be treated like animals. He did this in part because he'd been hearing a lot of noise from a particular Catholic priest in the New World, Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas' father had been one of Columbus's voyagers. He'd been on the second journey. Las Casas himself had been a slave owner. He was part of the plunder of the Incan Empire in Peru. He had owned Indians on Cuba and Hispaniola. But in 1514, he had kind of a road to Damascus moment, saw the light, freed his slaves, began preaching against the injustices that he had seen and that he himself had perpetrated. Las Casas denounced Spain for causing the deaths of millions of innocent people. He reported, in his words, "It is Spain's practice in every land they discover to stage a massacre to make the inhabitants feel." He listed in really shocking detail the cruelties carried out by colonizers, including burning men, women, and children alive, enslaving the survivors. Las Casas, like the Pope, insisted that Indians were rational human beings, not barbarians, and that Spain had no right to deprive them of their freedom and their land. Now, Las Casas did believe that Spain had the right to rule the Americas. but he argued that Indians should be subjects of Spain. They should be Spanish citizens, not slaves. Largely because of Las Casas' efforts, in 1542 Spain passed what they called the New Laws. The New Laws said that Indians could no longer be enslaved. In 1550, Spain abolished their old labor system, the encomienda system, which had allowed settlers to have total authority over Indian lands and Indian people. In its place, the government established the repartimiento system. Under this new system, residents of Indian villages were free. They were entitled to wages for the work that they did. However, they were still required to perform a certain amount of labor for the local government and the local church every year. They had access to land if they followed Spanish laws. They could not be bought and sold, but since they were still required to work that amount of labor, it still allowed for a lot of abuse by Spanish landlords, by priests. If the Indians would convert to Catholicism, sometimes they would be granted the rights of citizens, and sometimes the priests would really take advantage of that. They'll work 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years, and eventually I'll acknowledge that you've converted. A long struggle really ensued between the settlers and the missionaries and the colonial government for control of Indian labor. Every side declared that the other side are exploiting the natives, but we ourselves are being humane. By the end of the 1500s, work in the Spanish Empire was mostly made up of forced wage labor by Indians, slave labor by Africans on the islands. Like all empires, Spain was highly exploitive. Over time, that initial brutal treatment of Indians would improve somewhat. But Las Casas' writings, the abuses that he exposed, contributed to a really, really nasty reputation for Spain. They used to call it the Black Legend, this image of Spain as being unboundedly, uniquely brutal and exploitative. And that would become a justification for other European powers to challenge Spain's dominance, to try and establish new world empires of their own. So right now we're going to take a minute or two and we're kind of go off on a tangent about the Columbian Exchange, or sometimes the Great Biological Exchange. What this was is when these two groups of people met, Europeans coming to the Americas, both groups came into contact with things they'd never seen before. What the exchange was people coming over from Europe and bringing their stuff with them, and then going back to Europe and taking things from the New World. They completely changed the way people lived. They started exchanging plants and animals and also disease. That's what this exchange is. A lot of the assumptions that we just make today about how the world works come from this particular exchange. Like how we think of the Plains natives. You think of the Plains Indians like the Lakota. They're the brave warriors with the feathers in their hair, and they're streaming across the prairies on horseback. But they didn't have horses before first contact. Horses are not native to the Americas at all. They didn't have them in 1491. The first horses that they had were a pack of Mustangs that escaped from the Spanish and ran across the plains and created the Mustangs that we have today, the ones that Western ranchers hate so much because they cause so much trouble. So that's one of the ways that first contact still affects us. It really annoys the ranchers. So our idea of how Indians lived comes from that moment, this particular animal that was exchanged in this biological exchange, in this Columbian exchange. Now the Plains natives certainly hunted buffalo before the horses arrived. They just did it on foot, which meant that they couldn't travel as far. So we think of them going tremendous distances trying to hunt these and having these big territories that they hunted, and they didn't before the horses arrived. The horses actually sparked quite a bit of warfare between Plains natives. Now they can travel further but further means they're bumping into somebody else's hunting ground. And so we get Pawnee versus Lakota fighting going on and things like that. A lot of the crops that we think of as traditional to America, South American crops, Central American crops, actually came from Europe. Especially coffee and sugar cane. We think of those as New World crops, but they aren't. Colombian coffee, the old commercials with the guy with the burro and he's taking his coffee down the mountain. Coffee comes from the Middle East. It comes from Turkey and the Mediterranean. Sugar comes from Africa. We think of it as being grown in the Caribbean, which it is today, but it comes from Africa. Dandelions, of all things. I love dandelions. They're my favorite part of the spring, coming up in the yard, and you gotta do all sorts of stuff to get rid of them. Or you can just say to heck with it and blow the little puffs off and let them spread. Dandelions were deliberately brought over by Europeans, not because they wanted to annoy 21st century American landowners, but because it was a food crop. Dandelions are food. You can make wine out of them. The greens are wonderful in salads. And they're really, really easy to grow. Right? You can grow dandelions anywhere. So they were deliberately brought over as a food crop. Native American kids could not pull up a dandelion and make a wish on the little plant because they didn't have dandelions. The Europeans also brought over infectious diseases, airborne infectious diseases, that Native Americans had no resistance to. They had no resistance against any infectious disease. That's not what we think of as the major ones. Airborne diseases that spread through coughing or sneezing or contact with the air, like flu and measles and smallpox, those kinds of diseases did not exist at all in the New World. Native Americans had no resistance because they'd never seen anything like it. Now, there is some evidence of a plague-like virus that struck North America a couple of centuries before Columbus came. But by the time of first contact, there's been a number of generations that have grown up without any airborne disease. Now, Native Americans did have bloodborne diseases. They had sexually transmitted infections. So it's not like the New World was completely sickness-free. It's just that these airborne diseases were totally different in terms of how they were transmitted. So there was no personal immunity, and there was certainly no herd immunity. Smallpox was the worst. Smallpox is what absolutely devastated the native population from the Caribbean all the way to Alaska. Natives who came into contact with it might go and trade with another group, and they would be carrying this illness, and then that group would get it. And one of them, who's not showing any symptoms, would go off and trade with another group, and it would spread it to this town and spread it and spread it and spread it. It was like a wildfire across the continent. People who had never heard of a European were dying of smallpox because it spread so quickly. Now, there were things that came from the New World and went to the Old World and changed them. Plants were probably the most important. The crops of the Americas absolutely transformed the rest of the world. For example, what do you think of as the traditional food of Ireland? It is the potato, the Irish potato. They didn't have potatoes before first contact because it's not native to Europe. Potatoes are native to the New World, to Central and South America. Irish Americans today are the second largest ethnic group in the United States. Most of them descended from people who came during the potato famine. Wouldn't have had a potato famine without first contact, without the Columbian exchange, because they wouldn't have had potatoes. What about Italian food, or Italian American food, I guess? What is everybody's favorite sauce, the number one most popular pasta sauce in North America, in the United States? It's the marinara, the tomato-based sauce. Well, you wouldn't have gotten it before first contact, not in Italy. Walk into Olive Garden in Rome in 1491, ask them for spaghetti with marinara. They won't know what you're talking about. Not least because there was no Olive Garden in Rome in 1491. And God, I hope there's not one now either. That would just be sad. Every region of Italy today has at least one tomato-based sauce. It's especially popular in southern Italy. Who can imagine spaghetti without it? Tomatoes are native to Central America. There was at least one major disease that was American in origin, and that was syphilis. Syphilis is a really unfortunate STI, sexually transmitted infection, that can cause deformities, that can cause parts of you to rot and fall off, especially extremities like toes and fingers and noses, and then eventually it kills you. In fact, when Columbus returned home, when he went back to Spain after his first voyage, several of his sailors were already infected with syphilis that they had picked up in the Caribbean islands. So we know what they were up to. In fact, several of the wars during the 1600s and 1700s were affected. The outcome was changed by the fact that soldiers on one side or another had a worse case of syphilis that they had picked up from somebody who had gotten from a sailor who had been to the New World. The French invasion of Italy failed, in part because the French soldiers were dying of syphilis. It was still a major fear into the 20th century. The First World War. There were a lot of precautions taken to protect soldiers from syphilis. As an interesting aside, if you read books that were written in and were set in during the 1500s to the early 1800s in Europe, and you come across somebody who is being insulted, being called poxy or pox-ridden, it's not actually a reference to smallpox. It's a reference to syphilis. That person is being accused of having syphilis. But when you look at it, you can see how absolutely profoundly this exchange of these different biological aspects affected the entire world that we live in. Not just in North America, but all over the globe. The foods that we eat, the animals that we have, the diseases that we catch. Now, one of the things that we talk a lot about when we're discussing the history of the United States is freedom. What does freedom mean now? What did it mean then? And depending on when the then was, it meant vastly different things. The kind of freedom that early European settlers wanted, what they understood as freedom, was not the same as freedom understood by the natives. The Europeans believed that Indians were, at the same time, they were both too free and also desperately in need of being freed from their own cultures. In Europe, freedom was not a right. There was no concept of that. Freedom was a privilege. But privilege means private law. So the freedoms that people had very much depended on their station in life, on the privileges that came with their status. Now, the time period that we're talking about, the late 1400s, early 1500s, in lots of parts of Europe, this is still the medieval era. There was still feudalism in almost all of Europe. If you were a good supporter of the king, he would give you not just land, but all the people that lived on it. If you owned land, you had serfs. Serfs were people who were bound to that plot of land, people who owed you their service. They couldn't leave that land. They couldn't refuse to work for you. They were essentially slaves. In England, that had begun to decline by the 1500s, but it wasn't actually outlawed until 1660, until after England had started their North American colony. So they certainly brought that tradition with them. In France, feudalism lasted until the revolution in the 1780s. In Russia, it lasted until 1970. Their ideas of freedom were not our ideas of freedom. Ours have changed. But let's look especially at England. England was a little different from France and from Spain. Their feudalism was in decline already. They did have a parliament, which is similar to Congress. Parliament had two houses, just like Congress does. But one of those houses was the House of Lords. How that worked is, if you had a title, you were a nobleman, you're the Duke of Ottawa County, you automatically got a seat in the House of Lords. You got a vote on how the government was run. And then you'd pass it on to your son and to his son, and on down the line. And it didn't matter if you or your son was really too stupid to hold that position. You were born there, so you got it. These were the folks that advised the king. These were the people that tried aristocratic criminals. These were the people that really controlled most of the laws in these days. Unelected people had this power. They did have a House of Commons. The House of Commons was elected. But the Commons didn't have much power at this time. And mostly the Commons were made up of very wealthy men who wanted to become noblemen. They were elected by other wealthy men. They did not represent the majority of the people. Most of the adult men in England could not vote. You had to own a certain amount of land, and well over half the men in England at this time owned no land at all. And all of these different levels of society had their own privileges, their own freedoms. Serfs, no right. When serfdom was abolished, serfs became peasants. Peasants had the right to earn wages, but that's pretty much it. The cities had kind of a middle class, traders, craftsmen. The king would issue each town what they called town privileges, which would include the right to have a market, the right to have a town council. But not really right. I use the word right and I shouldn't have. Privileges. The privilege to have a market, the privilege to have a town council, and that privilege came from the king. And if you pissed off the king, your town might lose its privileges. And it might also be sacked and burned to the ground, in which case your right to have a market day is the least of your problems. Landowning men had the power to demand labor from their peasants, but they did have to allow the peasants to keep part of the harvest for their own survival. They also had the right to demand military service from their peasants. So Lord A goes to war against Lord B. He gets to demand that every man on his land suit up and go fight. Noblemen who owned huge parcels of land, they could demand that same tribute from smaller landowners. They could demand military service from lesser lords. And of course the king could demand just about anything he wanted. There were some limits on him, but only a few. The king had the privilege, the freedom, to mete out much harsher punishments to those who betrayed him. You're a peasant, you disobey your lord, he might fine you in crops. If you're real mad, he might hang you. You commit treason against the king, you're hanged, cut down while you still live, drawn, which means having your intestines taken out, and then cut into 4 pieces to be spread across the kingdom as a warning against anybody else who wants to commit treason. But there again, it depended on your social status. If you were a peasant who committed treason, that was a punishment. If you were a nobleman, you'd only be beheaded. Same for women. Different punishments for women based on their status, or rather based on the status of their husband. Usual punishment for adultery, if your husband's just a regular dude, is having the tip of your nose cut off. Adultery against the king could get you burned alive. They never actually carried that one out in England. They only beheaded the innocent king. The only restraint on the king was the church, was the Pope. And after the Reformation, Protestant countries didn't even have that. In that kind of society, when somebody wants freedom, he doesn't mean living outside the system. He means moving up in that system, which made Native America look like anarchy to Europeans. Anarchy careful to use those two words. Archy means rule by. Anarchy means rule by none. And there's nobody in charge. There's no government. Monarchy means rule by one. So there's a king, there's a lord, or there's somebody in charge. There are things like oligarchy, which means rule by a small group of people, aristocracy, rule by noblemen, lots of different archies, right? Democracy, rule by the people. Autocracy comes from the same root as archy. Oh, anarchy means there's nobody in charge, which is actually true of a lot of native nations. There's a chief in charge, there's a council in charge, but they're elected. They weren't born into that position. They don't automatically have that power. And Europeans would go to Native Americans and say, all right, where's your king? And they're like, we don't even know what that word means. Who's the guy that was born into power? We don't even know what that means. Well, we don't have anything like that. So that's one of the problems that Europeans and Native Americans had in communicating. Christopher Columbus, when he first came over here, and even Vespucci as well, they described the Indians they met as being very friendly, helpful, gentle. But those images were soon overshadowed by much more negative images. Early European descriptions of Indians as barbarians centered on three areas. It was religion, land, and gender roles. Whatever country they came from, European newcomers often assumed that Indians did not have a genuine religion. They're too free. Their religion doesn't crack down on them enough. Their healers were called witch doctors. Their ceremonies were superstition and nothing more. And of course, Europeans claimed that natives had not actually used the land. The land is too free because the natives aren't using it right. The natives aren't holding it close enough. It's too free. Therefore, it's free for anybody to take. And of course, they viewed the roles of women and men as being contrary to their understanding of how gender should be performed. Indian men were seen as unmanly by many Europeans because they hunted. Hunting to a European was not work. Hunting was play. Hunting was regulated in many European countries. Most of the hunting land was owned, say in England, most of the hunting land was owned by the king. So you want to hunt that land, you need the king's permission, which essentially means you need to be the king's friend. And if you're not the king's friend, you don't get to hunt. Farming is work. Farming is what most men did. So they come to the New World. They see native men going off hunting, native women farming, and it looks to them like the women are doing all the work and the men are just buttering off having a good time. The colonizers quickly decided that Indians did not understand true freedom. Early English and French dictionaries for Indian languages had no entries under freedom or liberty. They usually had no entries for king or slave or oppression either. Europeans considered Indians barbaric in part because they did not seem to live under real government. Of course, they had government, they had laws, but Europeans didn't recognize them as real governments because it wasn't hereditary and it didn't seem to have as much control. In a sense, they were just too free for European comfort. One Italian explorer wrote back home that the Indians he met lived in absolute freedom. He didn't mean that as a compliment. Others said that it would be better for the Indians to be made slaves so that they could be taught freedom. Yeah, I don't even know how that would work. The European idea of freedom as a privilege, one that was usually tied to land ownership, didn't have much meaning for Indian societies. In those cultures, individuals were expected to think for themselves. They didn't always have to go along with collective decisions, but generally, in a native society, people were judged according to their ability to help the collective. Everybody had to live up to that standard. There was no special rules for different people. There was no don't beat your wife unless you're the chief. The well-being of the nation and everybody in it was more important than stratified privilege. From the beginning, dreams of freedom inspired and justified European settlement in America. But as colonization began, freedom was not one single idea that everybody was fighting for. It was a collection of distinct rights and privileges. And many of those privileges were only enjoyed by just a tiny percentage of the population. The late 1500s, the early 1600s, when England started to try to found their permanent colonies, was a time of change. The old ideas were falling away. New ideas were taking their place. Some of these new ideas were actually quite old, stretching back to ancient Greece. Some of these ideas only lasted for a handful of years, but some of them laid the foundation for our modern concept of freedom. One of the common definitions of freedom, one of the ways that people talked about freedom in these days, was Christian freedom. And this was not a political idea. This had nothing to do with social station or political rights. It was a moral condition. Freedom, in this definition, meant being free from sin and a servant of God. The Bible says, 2 Corinthians, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And you think about people back then, think about the majority of the people back then, they were peasants. The only liberty they could get was this. So they certainly didn't have any privileges. They could only hope to be free of sin and a servant of God, to have that Christian freedom. Nothing else was available to them. A Christian liberty had nothing at all to do with religious freedom or religious tolerance. So be sure you understand that when it's time for the test. This didn't mean practicing your religion the way you want to. There was no concept of that during this time. Every nation in Europe had a specific established church. Every nation told their citizens what was and was not an acceptable form of worship. Dissenters weren't just punished by the church, they could be put to death by the secular government, by the state itself. Most rulers believed that a common religion, religious uniformity, was necessary to keep public order. Like, people can go around believing what they like about God, and they might start believing what they like about the king and the government, and we can't allow that. The idea that a person's religious belief should be their own private choice and not a public obligation was unheard of. Now, there were religious wars going on all over the place, sure. But those wars were never about the citizen's right to choose his or her religion. Those wars were about the ruler's right to choose which religion he was going to force on his subjects. There was a deep-seated terror of anarchy, of no ruler. So freedom, the concept of freedom was kept very close, kept tight. Any step outside the ordinary had to be squashed quickly. Freedom meant living within the law, knowing your place, obeying one's master, whether that was a landlord or a king or a pope. In its secular form, that was true as well. Freedom meant obedience to a higher power. Freedom was not anarchy. It wasn't obeying your own rules. It was obedience to a higher power. But the rule of law, even under that understanding, still didn't apply to everyone equally. Inequality was built into the fabric of life. Within English families, men exercised absolute authority legally under their wives and children. According to the legal doctrine of coverture, when a woman married, she surrendered her legal identity. She became covered by that of her husband. She couldn't own property, she couldn't sign contracts, she couldn't control her wages if she worked outside the home, she couldn't write her own will. In only the very rarest of circumstances could she try and get a divorce. Now, women did have some protections under those laws. A widow could control a third of her husband's estate when he died, but it wasn't hers, really. She couldn't will it to somebody else. When she died, it would become part of his estate again. Liberty, I can't stress this enough, came from knowing your place, fulfilling your duties. A well-ordered society depended on obedience. Freedom, privilege was a function of social class. Every level of society enjoyed its own degree of freedom. So in that sense, when England started founding its New World colonies, English freedom was still very medieval. Most of our modern civil liberties did not exist. The law told you what form of religion was acceptable. The government censored publications it didn't like, criticizing the government can land you in prison. The only freedom of speech that existed was for members of the House of Commons, Parliament, but only during parliamentary sessions. The second they walked out the door, they lost their freedom of speech as well. It was not an inherent, unalienable human right. Now, even though people with wealth had a lot more freedom, a lot more privilege than commoners, there were certain rights of Englishmen that applied to everybody within the kingdom. This was actually quite an old idea. The tradition of the rights of Englishmen comes from the Magna Carta, which was written in the early 1200s. So it's close to 400 years before the first permanent English colony. The Magna Carta was signed by King John after a very lengthy dispute with his noblemen. King John is the one that they call Bad King John. And if you know anything about the English monarchy, you kind of have to take a step back and wonder, out of all those guys, what do you have to do to be the one who represents the bad king? The Magna Carta lists a series of privileges granted by the king to all free men of our realm, to freeborn Englishmen. Now, at the time the Magna Carta was signed, early 1200s, it did not apply to most people. There weren't very many free men. That was still firmly the days of feudalism. Easily half the men in England were not free. But over time, as feudalism slowly died out, the Magna Carta came to apply to more and more people. Once it was outlawed, once feudalism was outlawed, once serfdom was done away with, peasants were considered freeborn. And when that happened, the Magna Carta, the rights of Englishmen, applied to almost everybody. This came to be seen as the basis of English freedom. And there came to be this idea that even the king should be subject to some limits. There should be some privileges that the king should not be able to overrule for his subjects. That all men, regardless of status, should have certain rights, almost. Trial by jury. Face one's accuser. Don't get thrown in jail for 15 years without being convicted of a crime. At the beginning of the 1600s, 400 years after the Magna Carta was signed, when England was starting to form its colonies, freedom still only played a minor role in England's political debates. But during the 1600s, there was a series of political upheavals, one after another, that made the concept of freedom, what does that mean? How does it apply? Made freedom a lot more important. For one thing, Parliament was becoming more powerful. The House of Commons, the part that was elected, a seat to have the right to vote in England, you had to own land. When the House of Commons was first established, hardly anybody owned land. So they were only being elected by a very tiny number of people. But as time went on, as serfdom is abolished, more people own land, more men own land, more men can vote. The Commons, the House of Commons, are representing a larger percentage of the population. And so they're changing. They're changing in what they want, what the powers they want. And as they became more powerful, they insisted more and more that, first of all, the king should follow the law, that the law should apply to everybody. And secondly, that they, the Parliament, ought to have a larger say in what that law was. Now, the kings of England at this time did not look favorably on these ideas. If you look at the document I put on D2L listing the kings of England during this colonial period, we're talking about James I and Charles I. They like to think of themselves as absolute rulers, like the monarchs of Spain. They wanted total control. They did not want to share power with the parliament. They certainly didn't want somebody else, some elected commoner, telling them what to do. A civil war broke out between parliament and the king. There was a religious element to this war. Parliament tended to be Protestant. The House of Commons, I should say, tended to be Protestant, led by fairly strict Puritans. The king, at the time that the Civil War broke out, Charles I, was sympathetic toward Catholics. In 1649, Charles I was beheaded. The monarchy was abolished, and England was declared a commonwealth and free state, a nation allegedly governed by the will of its people. That only lasted for about 11 years before the monarchy was restored. But by that point, by the end of that 11-year period, this breakdown of traditional authority had created really intense discussions of liberty and authority and what it meant to be a freeborn nation. Just like in all revolutions, the idea of freedom suddenly took on new meaning in this Commonwealth period between 1649 and 1660. People started demanding things like freedom of the press, freedom of speech. New religious groups sprang up. They demanded free religion, religious toleration for them. Different political groups sprang up wanting other freedoms. One of these groups was called the Levelers. They became England's first democratic political movement. They wanted a written constitution. They wanted an expanded right to vote. They wanted to abolish the House of Lords, that unelected body. Some of them said that every adult man should have the right to vote, regardless of how much land he owned. Some of them even condemned slavery. The Levelers believed that freedom should be a universal entitlement. You're born free, you have certain automatic rights. Nobody had said that before. Completely bizarre idea. Another new group, the Diggers, went even further. They also believed that freedom should be equal, but they wanted to end the idea of private property as well. They believed that all land should be held equally and in common, and that would end poverty. Now, these were very small groups, the Levelers and the Diggers. They never had many followers. The people in power absolutely hated them. But they did have an impact, certainly on American ideas of freedom. One of the ways of getting rid of pesky political radicals in the old days, if there are too many to hang, is you pack them up and you ship them off to the New World. So British North America got more than its fair share of radicals, people like the Levelers, people like the Diggers, and that's going to create a very different political atmosphere here than in Great Britain. Most importantly, this Commonwealth period, this time without a king, changed the way people understood how you get freedom, where your privileges come from. We look back at the Magna Carta, the rights of Englishmen, traditional rights of the freeborn Englishman. Those privileges were specifically said to be granted by the king. In 1649, they whack off the king's head. There is no more king. Where do your rights come from? Do you still have those rights? Do you still have the right to trial by jury? Do you still have the right to face your accuser? Do you still have, imprisonment? No self-incrimination? Do you still have those rights? You still want those rights, but if there's no king to give them to you, how do you justify having them? That's where people like the Levelers come in. The Levelers were very small. The Levelers never had a lot of power. But the idea that there were some innate, inborn, universal human rights had to start here. It had to. Society would have completely fallen apart. It would have turned into a totalitarian state. You say, all right, the king's gone. The king gave people their rights, so now there are no more rights. So England essentially would have fallen apart. But it didn't because people came up with this new idea, came up with this new concept to explain why they should have certain privileges and rights. And that absolutely going to affect how the United States, or how the English colonies, England itself and the English colonies, are going to develop over the next several hundred years. All right, this is the end of the first lecture. So you are free to turn it off and go on, do one of your quizzes,